everyone. I'd like to call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar.
Here.
Councilmember DeBala.
Here.
Councilmember Costick. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Searcy.
Great. There are no additional agenda items for this evening. Looking toward next week, on Monday night, September 24th, we will hold a joint meeting with the Commemoration Commission at 7:45 in the Hydrangea Room. This is open to the public, and it is actually a rescheduled meeting we had in March to discuss the names of streets in the city, particularly the names of the streets that were named after generals during the Civil War. So that will be Monday, September 24th at 7:45. Our regular meeting will be on Wednesday, September 26th. We have an administrative function session beforehand at 6 p.m. It is closed to the public, and we will be doing the city manager's evaluation that evening. During the public meeting that begins at 7:30, our voting session will include the first reading ordinance approving traffic calming for Hilltop Road, first reading ordinance approving payment in lieu of taxes for 126 and 128 Lee Avenue, second reading ordinance amending Chapter 3.04 of the Ethics of the Tacoma Park Code, a resolution approving the City of Tacoma Park settlement with Fairview Investment Fund 2 LP for the preservation of the 2.68 acres of land known as Dorothy Woods. We'll have a consent agenda that evening with a single reading ordinance authorizing the purchase of digital signage for the interior of the community center, a resolution for providing for appointments to the Ethics Committee and the Committee on the Environment. Our work session that evening will be an update on major city projects. On the following week, Wednesday, October 3rd, we will also go into an administrative function session that night at 6 p.m. to finish up the city manager's evaluation. Our public meeting following that at 7:30 will include a public hearing on the Community Development Block Grant Program. We will have a proclamation for Energy Efficiency Day and a proclamation for Indigenous Peoples Day. We'll have a voting session, a second reading ordinance approving traffic calming for Hilltop Road, second reading ordinance approving payment in lieu of taxes for 126 and 128 Lee Avenue, and a single reading ordinance authorizing the purchase of Adobe licenses. On Wednesday, October 10th, there will be no city council meeting as a number of the city council members will be attending the Maryland Municipal League meeting, conference, fall conference. All right. Now we'll move on to public comments on voting items. Our first voting item is the first reading ordinance amending Chapter 3.04, Ethics of the Tacoma Park Code. Does anyone have any comments on that voting item? Our second voting item is a resolution providing for a reappointment to the Tree Commission. Any comments on that? Seeing none, we'll move to our voting session. The first item is the first reading ordinance amending Chapter 3.04, Ethics of the Tacoma Park Code. Would someone like to move the ordinance?
Yes.
Councilwoman Costick moved, Councilwoman DeBala second. Any discussion or questions?
It remains the same from, there
From
weren't
prior
any
to
changes
that.
since last week.
Okay. All right, all those in favor of the ordinance, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstaining? All right, and we'll have the second reading coming up soon. Next, we have a resolution providing for the reappointment to the TRIA Commission. Would someone like to move the resolution?
So moved.
Councilwoman Smith moved. Do I have a second?
Second.
Councilmember Siemens second. Any discussion or comments? All those in favor of the resolution, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstaining? All right, that concludes our voting session. Next, we have public comments on any other topic. If you have any public comments, please come to the podium, state your name and address, and you have 3 minutes. And if your first time doing public comments, at 30 seconds, it will beep, but you still have 30 seconds to talk, so.
Thank everybody for coming, including the council and other people. I would like to say that there are a higher percentage of Black Americans and people with and/or people with disabilities who are low income and cannot afford a home in Tacoma Park, and I wish there were more. And I see in my neighborhood, Black and/or lower income people are moving out more and more, and I had a diverse neighborhood of wealthier and less wealthier people. Now it's mostly wealthy white people. I do not feel akin to them. I'm sorry. I go to parties. I've been to parties where they talk about, oh, they're so sad that the third kid couldn't get into Harvard and stuff like that. And my only kid has autism. So, I mean, you know, he's a doorman. I mean, they think people like me are scum. I hate to say it, okay? So, anyways, I would like to also ask that I think that, and no one asked me to do this, I think the council members should get a lot more than they do, and I think the city could cut back on certain things. A lot of this I call street gentrification, all this unneeded street narrowing, except in special places like daycare centers and disabled buildings. Why can't you cut out some of the, I heard it's $5,000 now per speed hump. Why? Why can't that $5,000 be given to you and you and you and you? Except, like I said, in certain areas. And I would find the citizens who don't keep their property cut down so people like me can't, including disabled people, and I'm disabled, walk on it. Why you find them? You could get some money out of it maybe if they pay. But anyways, and there's a few other things, but I would step on people's toes, anything I say to take away from. So, but my main thing is the street gentrification. Also, I live about 3 blocks from 410 in Jackson, and they're going to spend over $1 million on this Welcome to Tacoma. It's unnecessary. I'm sorry. I've lived there for 32 years. I don't consider it necessary. Give that money to you all. And to people with parents with special needs, adults, and to help more Black Americans move in, buy homes. That money could be better spent. It's like icing on the cake. I'm more concerned with the cake, not the icing. That's pretty, it's pretty, but it's not necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mashiri. Any other public comments this evening? No other public comments? All right, we'll move on then to council comments. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I especially like to welcome Bill Sinbett tonight. It's good to see you back at the council meetings. You've been gone for so long. Anyways, I just last week we talked about need for some traffic calming on Hilltop Road, and I also brought up the question of erosion over on Hilltop. I had a chance to stop by and talk with some of the neighbors, and it was interesting to learn why this is occurring when that, it's basically the same landscape that's been there for years and years. It turns out that there are now so many deer in the neighborhood that they have eaten all the foliage off the hill. And because of that, the rain now pours down the hill very rapidly and has created a real gully, soon to be a canyon, I think, going down from the backyards of those homes down to the road, and then the dirt just washes on out into the road and on across stops in the middle of the road and requires the city to do some work. I'm going to be exploring different ways maybe of how we can address that problem. But I think the root cause is the deer population, and I have no suggestions for how to solve that. I could tell you all the things that don't work right now, but if anyone has any ideas, bring them forth. Thank you.
Thanks. And before we continue with the council comments, I would like to say on the deer thing, we did have someone come last fall, was it 2 years ago already? No. Time is flying by. Who provided some really interesting feedback, and maybe we could see if we could have the person back again. One of the things that was pointed out is that the deer are actually now living in our backyards. They're no longer coming from like Sligo or Rock Creek, and he had suggestions for how to make your backyard less hospitable. So, all right, so we can
create a stream.
Yes. One way. Councilwoman Costick.
Thank you.
I have a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to thank Daryl Braithwaite and the Public Works Department for helping out with some flooding issues along Eastern Avenue that were the result of some issues with the Pepco's contractor. It was really great that she was able to connect with those people and help them through that process. I also want to let people know, and I've sent an email out, and I think a lot of people already know, but there may be others who haven't heard, that Centro Nia, which is a child care provider and had intended to purchase the property at 117 Elm Avenue, the John Nevins Andrews School property, is announced that they will not be able to move forward with that proposal as they had planned. And their CEO and president, Myrna Peralta, shared a brief statement with me that she wanted me to share with the community to provide some thanks to the community for their support during this process. So the statement is, on behalf of Centro Nia, I want to inform the Tacoma Park community that we will not be moving forward with the purchase of the school property at 117 Elm Avenue. Last-minute changes in the financing structure and lack of certainty on the number of children we would be allowed to enroll by zoning make the project untenable for us at this time. This decision was made even more difficult by the mostly warm and excited reception we received from the Tacoma Park community. We will continue to explore other options with the intent of bringing an affordable, high-quality child care center to Tacoma Park. Thank you for your support. So I just wanted to share that and also let residents know that we, among us, the mayor and Councilmember DeBala and I have been discussing possibly arranging a resident meeting for Ward 2 and Ward 3 residents, and anyone else is welcome to come along to discuss any interest, concerns, goals, thoughts that people have regarding that property and moving forward. And we'll share some information about that in the future as that's arranged. And then finally, I also wanted to let people know I serve on the Transportation Planning Board for the Council of Governments, and the project we're working on right now is the long-range transportation plan that is for the entire metropolitan regional area. It's called Visualize 2045, and we're in the process right now of finalizing that, and we'll be voting on it next month. Right now it's open for public comment, I believe, until the 7th of October. And I'd encourage people to take a look at it. It has some really interesting information about looking forward, demographic trends, anticipation of where people will be driving, taking metro, taking buses, how many people will be driving in 2045 versus now, those sorts of predictions, as well as the projects that are anticipated. So if anyone is interested in taking a look at that, you can go to www.mcog.org/visualize45. And I'll also share that information in my weekly updates if anyone's interested in taking a look and commenting. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith?
I'll go next.
Oh, okay, sorry. Councilwoman DeBala?
Yeah, thanks. Couple things. Thank you to the police officers who came out last night to the Forest Park neighborhood. We had a great and spirited discussion, and I'm really grateful that community policing is with us. That was a great example. On Thursday, September 27th, a week from tomorrow, there'll be a community meeting here on the Lincoln Avenue sidewalk construction for people who are in that neighborhood, want to get the latest on what's up with that. This coming next week or so, there's several, speaking of COG, there's several Metropolitan Council on Government meetings related to energy, the environment, and the Chesapeake Bay. So I'll be attending several of those and hearing, I hope, about my new favorite topic, stormwater. And last but not least, I have a question for the city manager on the status of the Gateway project. Several residents have asked me. That's the project at New Hampshire and East West Highway.
At this point, it's kind of wrapping up, which is really really exciting. There's a small section of paving that still needs to happen on
on New Hampshire Avenue. The installation of the lights will take longer, so they may complete one section and then have to come back and do some work with the lights. But my understanding is they even have the signs and stuff ready, and many of them already installed, so it's very close to completion.
Okay, I heard last night that the signs coming west, from the west, going into Tacoma Park on East-West Highway are still offset, but you're telling me that
They're working on
they're
those,
working on it.
yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Councilmember Searcy?
Good evening, everyone. So first, I just want to thank the residents of Hillwood Manor. Had a wonderful opportunity to visit the garden, the Hillwood Garden that they have there, alongside the mayor, and also staff from the Maryland, Montgomery County Parks, Mohammed. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And one thing that I appreciate so much about what the residents are able to do there is that they brought so many different groups together in order to create not a garden in a traditional sense where you're planting fruits and vegetables, but it's also it's more of a beautification effort off of New Hampshire Avenue, State Highway, on county property to some extent. Leveraging city staff and resources from the county as well, and as well as volunteers and volunteer contributions in terms of plantings and things. And so thank you so much to the residents at Hillwood Manor and Pam, who really is championing the garden. It was a really great opportunity. Couple of quick updates. So night market for the Tacoma Langley Crossroads Development Authority is on Saturday, the 29th. And it's from 4 until 7 on Ann Street between University and Hammond. And also, don't forget, every Wednesday is the farmers market, Crossroads Farmers Market. Wanted to give folks a quick update on Becca Lilly. So for folks who may not have gone back there in a while, there was a tree that fell on the playground. The county has worked to remove the tree. However, we've been waiting patiently for the turn of the fiscal year as well as equipment. So I have been told that the equipment to replace the playground that was damaged by the downed tree is on order. Unfortunately, it will take 7 weeks for it to arrive, but we are expecting the playground equipment to be in and installed sometime in mid-October. So just want to thank residents for their patience. Also, just as a reminder, there's just a lot of construction that's happening on New Hampshire Avenue. We've already heard about Ethan Allen, but there's also work that's happening in WSSC on New Hampshire between Auburn, Linden, and Erskine and Kingwood, and they're going to be working at night. For the city manager, one question that residents ask, because there's a lot of construction, they're learning to sleep with earbuds. Are there any like noise mitigation requirements that WSSC and others who are working in the area at night are required to follow? And I should have asked Daryl this, but unfortunately I forgot.
Not really. They have to file a noise plan, and it gets reviewed, and if there are steps that can be taken to reduce it, that would be built into the plan, and the comments that are issued from the plan. We're not the ones that approve it. It's, a lot of times it's through State Highway, but often we see them. If there are specific complaints, though, people should report those. If it's something that's disruptive at night and it's immediately strongly disruptive, they should call our police dispatch number, and then they can report that to State Highway, or they could go out and see if there's something that could be dealt with at the time. But then we can follow up during the regular day and see and work with the project manager and see if there's some other kind of steps that might be taken, or it might be changed to a different day or something. So we do try to work with folks on that, but it's more conversation than any kind of a stick that we have.
Okay, great. So I'll make sure to just let residents know that it's okay to
Please,
still report it.
please report it. If there's a real problem, we want to know.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Smith?
I just want to remind my colleagues that tomorrow is the Montgomery County Chapter meeting of the Maryland Municipal League. The great city of Rockville will be hosting us. And it is an opportunity to talk to the Montgomery County Board of Education. Thank you. Oh, and it starts at 6:15.
Councilmember Kovar?
Thank you, Mayor. Just one thing I wanted to mention. I wanted to thank PEPCO and also city staff. Daryl Braithwaite seems to attend multiple meetings after regular working hours, and there was an update at Montgomery College, actually, so thanks to them for making space available. And this was an update on the project, the construction project that PEPCO is doing that really affects a number of different areas on the border of Tacoma Park with DC and actually in North Tacoma. And for those who weren't at the meeting and are curious, the working day detour that gets set up every day that covers, sends cars down Baltimore Avenue and up Albany to get back onto Tacoma Avenue, that's expected to last continue on up until the early part of November. Meanwhile, a second detour, and again, the work is going to be done just during Monday through Friday during working hours. That's going to cover Fenton from Tacoma Avenue, pretty much along the length of the campus of Montgomery College up to where it connects with New York Avenue by the Student Center in Silver Spring. And that's already underway and probably going to last until February. So that's about a 6-month process. So at the moment, there are 2 detours you'll encounter in Tacoma Park going through North Tacoma, soon to be reduced to 1. And the hope and the expectation is that they'll get to that spot at the far end of the campus where Philadelphia comes in before WSSC gets there with their water main project. So I'll be sending out some information about it later, but I just wanted to let people know that relatively soon one of those detours will be removed, but they're going to continue for a while if you have to drive to Silver Spring.
Great. I just have a couple of updates. I also want to add my thanks to the Hillwood Manor community for the garden rededication. It was a great day, and thankfully it didn't rain on us. We got a break in the rain. Also want to thank everyone who volunteered and put on our folk festival this year, and including thanks to our police department, public works, and everybody on the city staff who also helped out, and all the volunteers, and even our city manager and everyone who volunteered helped keep it clean and running well. Just an announcement, our youth council's newsletter is out for, I think it just came out today. It's an excellent newsletter, as always, and gives some very interesting updates on what our youth council is doing over the summer. So check that out. On Tuesday, it is September 25th. It is voter registration day. And our Board of Elections and volunteers will be registering people to vote at Montgomery College, Washington Adventist University, and at the Metro. We thank our Board of Elections and all the volunteers for helping people register to vote, and that is on Tuesday, the 25th. And I guess I'll turn it over now to the city manager for her comments.
Thank you.
Sorry, real quick.
Oh.
2 quick announcements. Lunch with the mayor.
Yeah, lunch with the
yeah.
mayor.
Okay.
It's Friday.
We do, right, Friday. It is.
I think it's at
Yes.
El Campeon
Yes,
on Merrimack.
yes, thank you.
I was trying to make sure. I'm like, I forgot it.
I did too.
So lunch with the mayor is on Friday.
Yep.
902 Merrimack Drive at noon, so please come out.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there is, the Tacoma Foundation is hosting their Beer Fest.
Yep.
And that is on Saturday. So get your tickets.
Yep.
And lastly, tomorrow is Ward 6 LED field trip. Okay, so we don't know what these LED lights are because they're not on our street, so we're
Yeah.
trying to figure out what they are. So just as a heads up, after talking to Daryl, we may change the start location, just so that folks can kind of get a feel for some of the brighter lights that may be indicative of what you might see on New Hampshire Avenue, as well as some light examples of what may be residential. There's another that is scheduled for next Thursday, but depending on how things shape out in terms of the different lights that may be in place to kind of varying Calvin. We'll schedule additional little walk-arounds later in the month. So for those that are interested in joining me tomorrow, I will send an email out letting everyone know of the various stops on the tour. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to take a moment and share information on Dorothy's Woods and the closed session that was held on September 10th. I think I'm just going to go ahead and read the statement. I think that would work the best. On September 10th, 2018, the City Council met in closed session to consult with the City Attorney regarding options for the preservation of the city's interest in and control over the city-owned Dorothy's Woods parcel, which was subject to a foreclosure action by Fairview Investment Fund, the holder of a lien secured by the property, and scheduled to be sold at auction on September 13th. Fairview sought to collect $382,600 in principal, interest, penalties, and expenses from the proceeds of the foreclosure sale. Dorothy's Woods, a 2.68-acre, mostly wooded parcel, is one of the largest undeveloped properties in Tacoma Park. The city purchased Dorothy's Woods at an IRS auction in 2015 with the primary intent of preserving it as open space. Preceding the September 10th council meeting, the city attorney engaged in negotiations with Fairview regarding securing the city's interest in the property by either purchasing Fairview's lien or having Fairview release the city's property from the lien. Fairview's lien was secured by the city's property as well as an adjacent property still owned by Washington McLaughlin Christian School, but Fairview's lien was the first priority lien on the city property and was subordinate to a lien held by the U.S. Department of Housing and Housing and Urban Development. We left out urban on the school's property. After considering the history of the negotiation, the limitations on the potential to recover additional funds from the Washington McLaughlin Christian School if the city purchased the lien, and the risk that the property would be purchased by a developer at the foreclosure auction, the council authorized a settlement with Fairview involving a payment of $250,000 to Fairview in exchange for the dismissal of the foreclosure action against the city's property and the release of the city's property from the lien. Mayor Stewart and council members Kovar, Dabala, Kostick, Siemens, and Smith voted in favor of the settlement. Councilmember Searcy voted against the settlement. As a result of the settlement with Fairview and the city's earlier negotiation with HUD for the release of the city's property from its lien, the city's property is now free from the $382,600 Fairview lien and the $624,800 HUD lien. The $250,000 payment will be made from approximately $150,000 of city funds and $100,000 in resident donations. The total expenditure of city funds to purchase the property and obtain the release of the Fairview and HUD liens is approximately $235,000, including legal fees, the payment to Fairview, and the purchase price at the IRS auction. This total was offset by $69,400 in earlier resident donations and the recovery of previously unpaid property taxes. This information is on the Dorothy's Woods project page, so it was in the interest of the council to release the summary of what happened at the closed session on the 10th. Turning to other information, we've got a call for a new youth council advisor. The city is seeking a new advisor for the youth council. The term of the current advisor is nearly up, and it's an excellent opportunity to work with awesome youth. Anyone who knows them knows that they're a great group, and so we hope that we have people to step up on this role. The role information on the roles and responsibilities of the position is on the website. And we want to thank the current youth council advisor, Ashley Nugent, who's done an excellent job helping the group get started. And so that was nice. I've got a quick note that I know it's fall, but already people are talking holiday time. And the 13th annual holiday art sale has a call out for vendors. So people who are interested in that should look on the website for how to apply to participate. Last Friday, at the Rec Center on New Hampshire Avenue, was the Recreation Department teen staff hosted the annual back-to-school event for ages 11 to 18 called the Glow Back to School Party. And this year's theme was Glow in the Dark Carnival. They had over 85 middle and high school students in attendance, and they had a variety of games. The one that I saw on Twitter was the live Hungry Hungry Hippo, where the police officers were like on a skateboard getting pushed around and trying to capture balls. I wanted to do that. It looked like a blast. And I heard from the officers that indeed it was a blast. So I think the kids had a good time. I will say the police officers had a really good time. And so we really appreciate both the rec staff and the police department staff for putting on a nice party for the kids kicking off the school year. I want to announce we have a new planning intern, Johannes Eagle Benehoff, and he seems like he's jumping right in, so we'll have an opportunity to introduce him around. Want to give kudos to our finance director, Susan Chung. She's recently passed the last of a series of CPA exams. She still has a few more steps to get the CPA. There's steps involved in that, but she's over the biggest hurdle, and we're all really happy for her. So it was nice news this past weekend. Got a nice, some nice feedback from a local landlord about our HCD staff. He says, as a landlord for over 20 years, I want to acknowledge and applaud the education and advice that I have received by the rental housing staff. This support has helped me in my interactions with my tenants and to understand and execute my responsibility as a landlord. Kudos to Mr. Moses Wilds for his vast knowledge and infinite patience. He's been a very helpful resource to me over the years. It's awfully nice to get those. We have information on positions that are open. And this weekend begins the ICMA conference in Baltimore. So we're getting our assignments of how to function as hosts for that. It's usually a really good convention in Baltimore. And so we'll bring back all the materials that we can that seem to be appropriate for Tacoma Park. Any other questions?
Great. Any questions of the city manager? No? I just want to also note, as Councilwoman Searcy mentioned, the LED lights that later in the week that we will be updating the blog post that is now currently on the website providing background information. Our Director of Public Works and our Sustainability Manager, I don't think have slept in the last week.
It's really remarkable. Yeah.
They have been working in addition to PEPCO meetings, WSSC meetings, and other things, very, very hard on the LED light project so that we can address the concerns that residents have raised as well as move this project forward. And so look for updates later on this week, and I think that is all.
That's it.
And so we will now turn to our work session, which is a review of and discussion of commercial real property tax.
Thank you. So in April, the City Council voted to remove the assessment of inventory as a part of the personal property tax assessment in Tacoma Park, effective for the fiscal year 2020. And this is, that action was taken to be consistent with our surrounding jurisdictions that don't apply the inventory tax. But one aspect also of the inventory tax was that it was, in some respects, very selective about who had to pay it. Just certain businesses that had inventory paid it, and sometimes it was unclear as to why they had to pay a bunch more versus some other businesses. And so there's been a lot of discussion over the years about whether or not that was the appropriate way for us to be obtaining revenue that we use for a variety of city services. The amount of revenue that we received for that inventory tax was about $320,000 for this year. And one of the discussions that the council had in considering the resolution and making that move to remove the inventory portion was that we needed to consider ways to offset that $320,000 loss. The resolution calls for coming back to the council with some consideration of a commercial real property tax and other measures to be considered in the budgeting process for FY20. The resolution discusses that by early January, the council should define what commercial means in the commercial real property tax. And that before that time, that there would be outreach to business and commercial property owners to discuss the various options and concerns, so that we, in crafting a real property tax for commercial properties, kind of make the right choices about advancing city goals. And so this is the first step in having that conversation about what is commercial real property tax, what might be considered eligible to have this extra tax associated with it, and some of the issues and processes that we might go forward to do. So I went ahead and put together a little PowerPoint I'll just walk through that I think is helpful, and then I have also passed out and have on the screen I will have a spreadsheet that I've passed out earlier that gives some examples from different properties. So tax revenue that the city receives right now includes real property, which is land, usually property, personal property, which includes the inventory tax through this year. There's also a category, doesn't bring in very much money, of railroad and public utilities. There's admission and amusement tax, income tax. There's a very small amount called bank share. There's a hotel motel tax, and then we get intergovernmental revenue from other jurisdictions. The tax rates for this year are the 52.91 cents for real property. And then there's the personal property and the railroad and public utilities rates have stayed the same for a number of years. One of the things that's interesting in Maryland is that municipalities can define categories of real property for purposes of taxation. Counties don't have that right. It's so rare when there's something that municipalities can do and counties can't do that it's kind of fun. Municipal governments can define what these categories are, and as I mentioned, the council is interested in considering a commercial real property tax category for FY20. When the State Department of Assessment and Taxation has some categories that they use more for statistical purposes, and I'm showing those categories here, and these are the City of Tacoma Parks numbers. And there's categories that are generally considered more commercial, so commercial condominium, or commercial residential, which tends to be really more mixed use. So if you put those together in Tacoma Park, the amount of real property tax that we currently receive represents about 1.1 million, about 9.5% of the real property income. Apartment buildings represent almost the same amount, 8.4%. Again, just over $1 million of the real property tax revenue we receive. And residential represents 82%, even outside of apartment buildings, 82% of the tax revenue that we receive, totaling about $12 million. Yes?
Is apartment building a building of 4 units or more, 10 units or more? Do we know?
I'll find out the definition of it. I'll find out the definition.
And what's a commercial condominium?
That's when you have a number of buildings. Actually, the various stores or offices own their unit, just like a rental,
Okay, thank you.
condominium for residences. Yes, sir.
One question, so this shows that the residential, the amount of funding that comes from the residential areas, not counting the condominiums, or with the condominiums, is over 80%. So do we know, or can we calculate what's the overall value of the residential property versus?
Oh, yeah,
the others?
I have those.
I mean, is this
it's-
more, how closely do these ratios meet?
It's the
Is it-
same rate. So what do you mean, how closely?
Well,
the rate?
so, I mean, 80% of the value of property
Yeah.
in the city is in,
Because these are done by the assessments
okay.
of the property.
I mean, to the extent that the assessments are caught up, basically, right, with the market values. I mean,
That's correct.
Right.
So, one of the things is that for single-family home occupied residential property, there's caps, so they may not pay the full value of the assessment. Those
Mhm.
aren't the case for commercial properties.
Okay.
So the commercial properties are more caught up, perhaps, than
That reflects
residential.
more what
So
they
it's
are
even
at the
more
market.
disparate.
Yeah, okay.
Just briefly, personal property tax applies to businesses. It consists of a base amount of equipment, furnishings, and inventory. As I mentioned, we've traditionally taxed inventory, but that will be eliminated next year. Two other small taxes. We have an admissions and amusement tax, primarily related to Chuck E. Cheese, and we have a hotel motel tax, so both in the $100,000 range. So how to define commercial? If you look at how Montgomery County defines commercial for its purposes, it includes multifamily buildings with what we traditionally think as commercial buildings. It's helpful to use existing definitions to the greatest extent possible, perhaps ones that the State Department of Assessment and Taxation use, or others, so that it's easy for the county to define the terms and calculate them, and identify that this property fits into such and such category. The staff's preference for the city is not to include apartment buildings in the commercial category. Not only is it kind of an apples and oranges situation, but it has a real strong effect in a community with rent stabilization, because that increase in price for these apartment buildings would not be able to be absorbed with the small increases allowed under rent stabilization. And but what that means, though, is that to get $320,000 puts a lot more weight on the other commercial properties. The general sense is that especially small home occupations wouldn't be counted as commercial. But when you have mixed-use buildings, we'd need to look at the definition about what that is and how that gets categorized. There was an interesting question that was raised about vacant land or almost vacant land. Should we be counting it as something that is commercial property, such as the J&A property or the Washington Adventist Hospital property once they move? It's zoned residential, but it's certainly not been developed as residential property, and it may not be used that way for some time. So there may be some other kind of category that we may want to define it, whether it is considered commercial or some other category. It may be worthy of having some extra level. Certainly within the draft Housing and Strategic Plan document, there was a strong urge to put a higher rate on vacant properties in general. But we may also be able to use this as a way to encourage the kind of use that we would want to see on some of these properties. Some vacant property is zoned residential, but we use it as parkland. Obviously, we may value it as parkland and not want it in that category. So we need to be careful about the definition. There may be interest in being more specific about the commercial property, or having credits or some other kinds of things that give a discount to the commercial property tax rate. So perhaps there's some commitment to local employees, or there's some other advancement of sustainable practices. Maybe they've really changed so that they don't have as strong an impact on stormwater systems. There's a variety of things that may come up in our conversations with commercial property owners that we may think help advance other city goals, and we could give some credit for that. Want to be really clear that a commercial property is not the same as a business. And so part of this is, again, apples and oranges. Some commercial properties just rent out to businesses, and they don't actually operate their own business on their property. They certainly may not have had any inventory, even if they did. And so one of the points that some people have said was, well, you'll save money because you won't get to have to pay the inventory tax, so this commercial property tax rate at a higher level won't affect you. That would be the case for some businesses and commercial property owners, but it's not for all. And so I think as we go through this, that's part of the reason this is a tough discussion. It also, though, goes back to the point of why we got rid of the inventory tax, and that is that it really just cut to a small segment and wasn't really a fair tax, perhaps. There will be an adjustment process in any case about moving to a commercial real property tax. There have been questions raised about how raising a commercial real property tax rate might affect an owner who's got a long-term lease with a business that may not accommodate tax increases. I think most commercial property owners do anticipate tax increases in their leases as part of the arrangements, but some may not because they might have wanted to keep a particular business or felt sorry for them or had some other arrangement. These are individual situations, and so it'll be interesting to hear from people to see what the situations are. There may be a category we might want to acknowledge. There might be a timing issue that we want to acknowledge, but it's awfully difficult to say that there's one answer that fits everybody. There's not going to be one answer that fits everybody. In terms of community outreach, we need to meet with commercial property owners this fall. And in looking through the schedules, it's probably going to be late October and early November. We would work with our business associations, Old Tacoma Business Association and the Tacoma Langley Crossroads Development Authority. We can prepare mailings, hold meetings, hold Facebook Live meetings, those kinds of things. Many commercial property owners do not live here. So one of the things that we'll need to take into consideration is how we communicate with them or the property managers about these matters. And so there may be some interest in something like a Facebook Live meeting to be able to really have some communication with somebody who might be based across the country. I recommend that we have the opportunities for the property owners to make suggestions about the categories, the timing, and obviously the amount of tax before the council kind of makes some firm decisions about what the categories should be. Obviously, it's some back and forth because we've got some ideas about that. We should share those ideas. But as we get into this, we may learn something completely unexpected that we want to take advantage of or reflect in the definitions. And so that's what I've got on this. And let's see. Ben, where did you put my other thing? Oh, maybe this. I got it, I'm sorry. I'm going to get to the. Thank you. Okay. So Ms. Thanes had prepared a spreadsheet that gave some examples of the impact of taxes on a variety of different kinds of businesses in Tacoma Park. And on this first page, you'll see, for example, the Tacoma Park Silver Spring Co-op, and in that case, for example, lists the value of their property, the value of their estimated value of their inventory, what their FY19 real property tax is for the state of Maryland, Montgomery County, and the city of Tacoma Park, as well as the Tacoma Park personal property inventory tax. And then it compares it with what would happen if you took out the inventory tax, but you imposed extra commercial property, real property tax. And in this case, about a 14-cent increase in the real property tax that if you just take the commercial properties, not counting the multifamily buildings, would approximate $320,000. So the co-op would save about $4,600. But a business that didn't have inventory, like Pollo Campero, would pay an extra $2,000 in that kind of situation. Again, you can look through and see some folks save, but most don't because so many entities don't have inventory tax. Again, we don't know what offsetting numbers might come from some other categories, such as the J&A or WA properties that might be larger, but that you might want to identify in either a commercial property category or a separate kind of property category that might take some of the burden of that $320,000 offset out of just the commercial businesses. So I think there's some flexibility. I know when the council was discussing the resolution on the inventory tax, there was also some interest in also looking to see if there's other sources of income that might help offset that. So I think there will be obviously a lot to be discussed during budget time, which is when you will actually set the amount. But this kind of gives a sense of the differences in businesses and the magnitude of things. You know, if you think about our commercial property owners, we've got some very large ones. They're not represented here, but in Ms. Cersei's ward, you've got major shopping centers, and so those are very large properties. In my view, the additional commercial property tax would not be a major issue for them. How that gets reflected to their businesses would be a point that we would want to know. I think at this point I can ask for questions or whatever, but that's a brief overview.
Great, thank you so much for the overview. So I think our goal for this evening is to provide feedback to the city manager on this presentation, focusing on some ideas of how we want to define commercial so that we can give feedback to the staff as they're setting up the meetings and doing outreach to the commercial business owners, and then also coming back to us with more information. And so tonight, why don't we take some time, give feedback on how we'd like to define commercial, and then if there's also additional data or research we need to do, you can point that out as well.
And the other thing, just I may have missed something there. I also very much want your input about if there's a specific way that you want to help us reach the commercial property owners, what those mechanisms are. I think we know how to do it, but if there's something that you particularly think would be a good idea, we'd like to pursue that.
Okay, so definition of commercial, other data we may need, and outreach efforts.
That's right.
Those are our three categories. And so why don't we start first with feedback on how to define commercial. Councilmember Smith, do you want to kick us off?
First question I have on this handout that you just went over, are any of these considered owner-occupied properties, do you know?
I believe Advanced Auto Parts is, actually, I think all of these are, that kind of work on that. Let's see.
Because the
The co-op doesn't really, yeah, they've got kind of a different situation, so that's got an asterisk. I'll have to double check on the.
I know for sure appliance distribution is owner-occupied.
I know Pollo Campero is, so.
Okay.
And I just want to say one more thing. In terms of trying to identify the owners, sometimes it's not that easy, and you have to do a good amount of research. So we've got a variety of databases and lists, but sometimes you end up spending a good amount of time on the computer. So that was something that I thought wasn't useful for preparing for tonight, but it certainly will be part of our process.
And if I could just comment on the outreach efforts real quick. Two groups that you could talk to that will get the information to the landlord, their property manager, and their leasing brokers. They will make sure that any type of changes in tax rates are presented to the landlord immediately. Now, you mentioned about what's going to happen if we do increase the property taxes. You're correct in saying that commercial leases individually, they can be different, but philosophically, landlords do not pay property taxes, insurance, or common area maintenance.
They usually disperse that to the businesses, yes.
So whatever we do, we gotta know that they're going to attempt to pass that through. So I think we should also look at some type of offsets that we can apply to businesses that meet the priorities we have, whether it's hiring local people, whether it's paying a certain wage, certain things that we think are important to the council, because this property tax, if it goes forward, will be pushed to the tenants. And then Councilman DeBala had a question about defining commercial multifamily. Usually 5 or more units is considered commercial.
And Councilmember Smith, can I ask you while we're on this, would you favor including apartments or not in this definition?
With rent stabilization, no.
I wanted,
But if I may just say one other thing, I would use this as a device to negotiate with our nonprofit landlords that we take out of rent stabilization, and they are paying different income levels are allowed to move into their properties. So they possibly, they want pilots from us.
if they want pilots, we can't, they don't get the money.
So, we need to talk to them about, we got to do something different. That we can't just say, hey, you can have 100% pilot. If you get a 50% pilot, then you got to pay this higher property tax.
Right, a pilot is a payment in lieu of tax.
Right.
No, I appreciate that, I understand that. I want to make a note about the idea of somehow finding offsets to businesses that meet certain priorities. One of the things that, as we go through this, needs to be easy to administer. So please be really careful about, those ideas and how they get quantified, and if there's something that we can use somebody else's mechanism for approval, so that we can just say, okay, yeah, we'll follow on that. So keep that in mind as we hear from people.
Okay. Councilwoman Searcy.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my point. I think, although we're having a pretty focused discussion, and I was one of the main people, like, if we're going to give the break, we need to figure out some way to recoup the money because our budget was what it was. However, I do think that this could potentially be a tool to create the right kind of carrots to incentivize the behavior that we want to see, the types of community development that we want, or any development in certain areas. One question, I think this was raised before, was, do we have any contacts either on the Prince George's side to get a feel for how they're categorizing commercial and, their rates similarly on the Silver Spring, Montgomery County, or maybe some other municipalities like Rockville, to see what are the categories that they have and what are some of the rates. I think that's important, particularly for Ward 6, because a number of the property owners are regional owners. So they're used to paying taxes, and they're used to being in different municipalities, and it would be helpful to know if, how the categories work and what are some of the rates that they've set in some other areas.
That sounds good. Like I said, the counties have a flat kind of definition for commercial for this purpose, but certainly they have different rates, and so comparing that and any other kinds of payments that don't count as real property tax but may come into that, it would be good to know that. We certainly also can compare with other municipalities. I will say that in some of our brief looks at other municipalities, there's some strange ways to do it that we may not want to do. But I've also seen some municipalities with some very creative definitions, so.
Yeah. And that might be helpful just if, for example, some of the categories that are at the county level that other municipalities have used, which means there may be an infrastructure already in place. Again, getting to that point of making sure that whatever we put out there is somewhat easy to administer.
Councilmember Kovar?
Thank you. Is it possible when, let's say, we make a change along the lines of what's being laid out in this chart, where some businesses will pay more than they did previously, right? And some will pay less. Is it possible if we could come up with a theory on how we would select businesses, but could we say, if you're a smaller business or if your percentage increase was more than a certain amount, we could limit how much you would have to pay, hold them harmless, or say, well, it could only go up by X amount, sort of the way it happens at the county level with the value of residential property? Because, what most of the businesses are going to look at is not, well, inventory tax was really fair, or this is much fair. They're going to look at, did my taxes go up or down, right? And so I just wonder, especially for smaller businesses who are maybe less able to meet the additional payments, is there some way we could structure it so that if it was more than X amount, dollar-wise or percentage-wise, we could say, okay, you don't have to? Or are we allowed to even make those kinds of?
I think we have a lot of flexibility. As far as I can tell, under the state of Maryland law, there's some pretty, there's quite a lot of flexibility. It's just, how do we count it? How do we identify what category that is?
Because when I look at the chart, if I'm reading it correctly, Still Point paying $710 more may not sound like that much, but they may be, less able to manage that than Hampshire Lodging paying $12,000. Because it varies on the kind of business you have in your overall financing more than just the absolute numbers, right?
Right. No, I think that there could be that. Obviously, what the commercial property owner might do that messes up any deal that we had could happen. The other thing when we get into the budget process is there's nothing to say that you wouldn't decide to increase the overall tax rate more and not make up as much, so you change things a little bit differently for a commercial tax rate.
Right.
So,
I do think any significant change does get passed along in some way. So,
exactly.
And I guess, one of the other questions for us is, the purpose of taxes is to raise revenue to do things in the city, but obviously the idea of assessing a rate is that someone living in the city creates certain needs and the city wants to pay for them. Someone running a business also creates certain needs, garbage and everything else that you have to do. Obviously, the inventory tax was one way of saying, okay, even if you're a renter, the presence of your business still has some impact on the city, and so we're going to ask you to pay that. Now, we're saying, well, we don't want to do that because we don't think it was fairly levied, and I agree with that, but I guess the question would be, if we increase the tax on the owners, are we sort of saying to a business that rents, well, we don't really think you have an impact on the city? Well, they do have an impact on the city, positive, but also leading to some costs. So I'm just not sure how we balance that, if the owner decides to just pass it all on to them, if that's fair.
Right. Well, I think, we can't look at this in isolation.
Right.
So we are providing, and we're trying to provide real economic development assistance as Purple Line's coming in. We provide police assistance. And so there's a variety of things that could be very specific to businesses that we're helping with and maybe doing a higher level of help than we have in the past. So you could say that there's a certain need for that. We also may be having certain things that are more burdensome on businesses, and so then this would be an additional burden on businesses. So you have to think about how that all works out. We'll be talking about this. It came up because of the inventory tax, but it can't be looked in isolation.
Well, the only other thing I would say, and I'll let others speak, I do agree with Councilmember Smith, if we can agree on ideas that we're trying to promote. I could imagine, for example, the B corporation concept, if there were B corporations, the benefit corporations that were to open in the city, and maybe we could say I think there are one or two that are here, and they're not all in Tacoma Park, some are just over the border, but that would be one example where it's relatively easy to sort of say, if you organize that way and you're incorporated that way, maybe you get some sort of break. So I would like us to at least look at those things. It might be hard to figure them all out, but it's something worth looking at.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilman Costa?
Thank you. Kind of just to get some of the logistical things out of the way first, I would support defining commercial as not including the apartment buildings. And I think outreach should go to not just to the owners of the property, but also to the tenants, because they
Right.
would be ultimately impacted.
Right.
So I think we need to hear from them as well. And then some of the questions moving forward that I would like us to have some answers on and some sense of would be if we could get a general number of owner-occupied versus leased spaces, that would be helpful. If we could get an average or a median change in from personal property tax to the real commercial property.
That one's, I don't know that it can be done, because inventory was so strange. Obviously, it's the same amount of an increase compared to the base real property rate, but if you were looking at how does that offset those that have inventory, I mean, it's really specific.
So, for example, what you have in this chart here, you pulled this up for these specific
That's
businesses,
right.
but it's not possible to do that for all.
No, it's
Okay.
not. And in fact, I've always had questions about the inventory tax amounts in any event. So, these are the best information that we have, but even these might be wrong for a specific business, just because inventory tax was part of the reason we didn't like it. It was hard to figure the actual amounts.
And so how did you select these as the example? You just
I think we
selected
just went
ones that you
around
thought-
town and picked a couple of varieties that, we tried to, these are situations where you don't have a lot of units on one particular property. It's trying to show something that you might have a picture of to get a sense about that difference. But one of the things that we still need to really spend a little bit more time on are some of the larger shopping centers or office buildings, and how does that compute?
Okay. And then in terms of nonprofits, were they paying personal property tax previously? I'm just thinking if they aren't paying personal property tax and the commercial real property tax applies to the owner of the building that rents to maybe some commercial and some for-profit and nonprofit businesses, that could create a situation where that could impact them.
Yeah, I will have to, I would have to look at that more.
Okay. And then I think the last thing is if we could look at some sort of phase-in, options for phasing something like this in to provide some opportunity to get used to the impact, that would be great.
Councilwoman DeBala?
Yeah. I was going to ask also about the option of a phase-in. And I do like the idea of looking at whether we can, several people said different variations of this, incentivize certain kinds of policies. Generally, I think this ought not to apply to multifamily buildings, but I would like to take one more look at whether there is some incentive piece before we let go of it completely, but my inclination is to say this shouldn't apply, because the focus should be commercial. On outreach, there's Old Town, there's Tacoma Langley, and I understand they're part of Old Town, but there's the junction businesses.
Right.
So looking at outreach to them specifically as well.
We would
as
make sure, and
Old
there's,
Town.
there's
there's
Flower
Maple
Erie,
Avenue,
and there's a
there's-
couple other
Right.
areas that don't fit in with it. It's just that I'll take help from administrators anytime I can, so, in convening folks, but, obviously, we would want to make sure that it's also well represented. So if some entity doesn't seem to be well represented in those things, then we need to make that extra effort.
Yeah, and I agree with Councilmember Costick that we should make a special effort with businesses who rent as
Mhm.
well
Yeah.
as, who are tenants, as well as
I didn't
owners.
mean to not include it that
Yeah.
way, but.
Yeah, and I had sent in a couple of requests for information, one of which Councilmember Costick mentioned. But the more we know about how many businesses there are, how many of them are owners versus renters, which ones are large property owners, and therefore already pay a fairly hefty property tax. It seems to me, I saw some of these tables when we were doing the budget.
I have
And
some,
so,
but I
yeah,
will
so
tell
we
you
can-
that there was also raised a number of questions, so I didn't feel like it made sense to go through them here tonight.
Right, but as we move forward, I would like to,
Right.
to see those things. Yeah, I think that's it, thank you.
Councilmember Siemens. Sorry, people are
Thank you.
going back around again.
Jumping in and jumping out. No, I agree, it should not include the apartments. I wonder, thinking of Councilmember Costick's request for additional data, I wonder if we couldn't, it might be difficult to do them all, but if we could do maybe a couple more of the smaller businesses. And then I wonder if a final line might be something of, percentage that gives us, tries to level out the field of big ones and little ones, of a percentage of the increase or decrease as compared to the real property value, or something that would kind of see as it impacting the bigger ones less or more. It's difficult just looking at the raw numbers to say.
Yeah, so that becomes more and more important the more that you start identifying things you want to incentivize or whatever. What we're talking about is a real property tax rate, so it simply goes on what the assessment is. And so it would be the same increase for a small property as for a large property. As to, for example, Councilmember Kovar's point, smaller properties may still not be able to do the same kind of percentage increase that a large property owner is.
Right.
But we'll try to provide as much clear information as we can.
Yeah, if there's just something that makes it easier to compare the different, and I'm thinking mainly between the big properties and the
Okay.
smaller businesses. Thank you. That's all.
All right, before people go back around again, I'm going to jump in. Regarding the definition of commercial, I agree with my colleagues who have said that we should probably take out multifamily in the definition. When it comes to the vacant properties that are not parkland, and so thinking of J&A, WA, and even though it is zoned commercial, also thinking about the white building on
Right. I
New
mean, I
Hampshire
think-
that has been vacant for many, many years.
Yeah.
And I would wholeheartedly support looking at a different tax rate for those types of properties, and in fact, looking at going back to the vacant property ordinance that we wrote a couple of years ago, and the definitions in there, and the amount of time we spent thinking about that. And I see my former colleagues sitting in the audience who worked very hard on that. But those, especially those larger properties, and one of the reasons I would support a higher property tax rate on those types of properties is they take a lot out of our community. They sit for many years, and
They require a lot of police
They require a lot of
attention
police and other
code enforcement.
attention. They also require, a great deal of attention from all of us, from residents who complain about them, because lots of times they're not kept up. So thinking about the different categories, I agree with my colleagues that we don't want to make this a cumbersome system to put in place. I would like to look at the possibility, even though it doesn't impact many people, it impacts a handful of people who are residents who also own commercial property in Tacoma Park. I'm thinking of people like Sue Emmerman, the Kittners. They are, as homeowners, paying taxes already, property taxes. you know, I agree they should pay commercial property tax on their buildings, but maybe not at the same rate, and should maybe get a discount there. Other categories such as whether or not people employ local employees or B Corp, sustainability efforts, I'd like to put that under categories of looking at some kind of credit versus having that in their definition, because I don't want to create a system like we did under the inventory tax, in terms of burden on people reporting things and other things, especially for small businesses. So I'd like to actually look at that maybe at another time in a credit system. And I think everyone covered the other data and outreach. At this time, I'm not sure I have anything else to add to that. So, all right. Back around again. Councilmember Siemens, that's old, right?
It's all-
Okay,
Legal,
Councilmember,
legal.
Councilmember Smith.
I'd just like to say that I would support a higher tax rate on vacant improved commercial property. But I don't think we should, if it's just raw land, that we should charge a higher tax rate. I would also, when we revisit this, like to see the number of landlords that have contested their assessments, their property assessments. I think that would be really interesting information.
For many, if they're the larger ones, you do it every time.
Yes. Yes, I do.
But yes, that's what I don't know if we would have that easily at hand, but we could look.
And I think that's it. Thank you.
Great. Councilwoman Searcy.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure, because I know we were chatting with mics weren't on. So I am against taxing residential properties in a commercial light. I think it's important for us to not just think about the businesses we have now and what their needs are, but the actual businesses that we want to draw to the area. There's lots of development opportunities here, and we don't want to basically box ourselves into a corner where we're not viewed as a place to set up shop.
So I'm sorry, so could you repeat again what you would not, you're against taxing residential property?
Right, so the apartment buildings,
Okay.
no, we need housing.
Okay, no, I wasn't sure because I was wondering if it was part of the vacant land situation, but
No.
you're talking residential
I'm
developed
talking
property.
residential.
Okay.
So if what we, and so my stance is not just on what we have now, but what we eventually want. And so if what we want, given rent stabilization, which could be viewed by some as a barrier to entry in terms of building in Tacoma Park, to encourage the development of new housing stock, which we currently do not have, then taxing apartment buildings in that way would serve as another barrier to entry, and we don't want that. I also agree with my colleagues in terms of vacant improved properties. Again, it's those motivating factors. How can we create, not only alleviate the burden that we experience financially, as was already mentioned, but we don't want vacant businesses in the community. Like, we want a thriving community.
Right.
And so what can we do to ensure that that happens? I think, as was previously mentioned, identifying a tax rate that would be appropriate would be important. Thank you.
Councilmember Kovar.
Yes, two other questions. Maybe you mentioned this and I didn't hear it, but when do we need to figure this out? Just by budget time or sooner than that? Because I know sometimes we run into these issues where, you know, to get it properly registered with the county or the state of what we're doing, there has to be some sort of lead time. So,
Well, I would like to have it before you break in December.
okay.
I would like to have the definition, because we need to get that into the county system. The rate that you put for that doesn't get done until you do the budget.
Okay.
But anything that requires us to work with the county folks who have to define it for their computer systems, we need the time to do that.
Okay.
So that's why I was looking at the late October, early November time period for really getting consultation with folks. But then there would need to be a pretty rapid decision. That doesn't mean it can't be changed from year to year. I think, it's malleable. But at least for the first cut, for the first year, we would need to have it, I think, I think December 5th or something is our last scheduled meeting, so.
So we need to figure out that outreach relatively soon.
Very
right?
soon.
So, and the one other question was, so the inventory tax is estimated to mean a loss, so to speak, of around $320,000, right? So obviously we want to not have that. How vital is it, in your opinion, to really get close to that? Or would you say it's just, let's get around $300,000? Or if other additional revenue is coming in anyway, do we want to sort of pocket that or apply it to this? Is that, it's not a yes or no question, but I'm just curious what you would say about that.
Well, I think I'm very concerned about the next budget. So I'm very worried about money. The Washington Adventist Hospital's delayed in moving to White Oak, so we're not going to be having the tax money from that property quite as soon as we thought we would. It's not taxed mostly right now, but it would be once it's vacated. And at this point, they're saying something like December of 2019. So there's a delay in that.
How much longer is that beyond what they originally said?
4 or 5 months?
Yeah, it's about a half a year. Nevertheless, it's always a puzzle with the budget, and so, we're likely to have the assessments come in on our housing much higher than they've been. We'll look at the constant yield, and hopefully we'll look at a constant yield plus inflation, and in conjunction with a very substantial increase in our reserves based on the reserve policy, even phased in. So, does it have to be 320,000? No. That's the determination you get to make. But it was identified at the time that we're volunteering for that hit because we're trying to make the system fairer, but we should try to see if we can offset it.
But also, I mean, I suppose if we're coming up with the definition first and then the rate potentially later, but the rate and the potential amount of revenue that will come in from the rate is an estimate, right? So we could pick that.
Yeah, but it would be pretty good. Yeah, we would come up with a pretty good estimate of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Councilwoman DeBala?
Yeah, so I agree on the vacant improved properties. I forgot to say it before. And it sounds to me like the next step is that outreach needs to start sooner rather than later. And some of these data requests, while I would love to have the numbers, are maybe not the first thing.
So
Well, it
I
might
also
be-
just want to clarify that Laura Barkley, Executive Director of OTBA, has already started reaching out to
Yes.
businesses.
Yeah, I think I went to one
Yeah.
already.
Yeah, when we were doing the inventory tax, we did have a meeting, but she is also, and I don't know if the rest of you have, but I've received emails and letters from commercial property owners in the area, because Ms. Barkley has been reaching out, and
Great.
I'm not sure if the CDA has started that, but we can.
Yeah, I could follow up with Kaylee to see, but I know that the board has had conversations, even when we were initially talking about
Right.
getting rid of the inventory tax. I mean, I think, the general stance from what I've gathered, from what I've heard from business owners, is they would prefer for us not to raise taxes. Like, who in this room would not like to pay taxes, right? But recognize, of course, the challenge that the city has in terms of in terms of meeting the budget. So, but I do think it's important for us to kind of think long, like next fiscal year, which is important, but also long term, right? So, is it necessarily the case that we need to make up that full amount next year? Maybe not. Maybe based on some of the categories that we come up with, we can fill the gap enough. And then as we're pursuing other areas in terms of improvements throughout the city, that money may self-correct, right? So I think it is important for us to really focus on the categories and the types of businesses, such that when we finally identify the rates and we can tweak them over time, life will be easier for us. So Yeah.
And I just want to underscore that I agree with Council Member Searcy in the importance of getting the categories right, because I think for me, understanding, putting these categories in place, go to what some of my colleagues have said about reflecting our council priorities in the city and what we're striving for. And so we have an opportunity not to just raise taxes on certain commercial property owners here, but to really take a step back now and be reflective of what are our goals, what are we moving towards, and how does our tax system reflect those goals. Right now, it doesn't, quite frankly, and we can do a better job of doing that, and this is our opportunity to do it. Getting the tax rate correct is going to be important, so we make sure it's fair and not burdensome to commercial property owners, but there's more time to do that. So, all right. With that, Councilwoman Costick.
I just briefly wanted to note that I think when we're doing the outreach, we should try in particular to emphasize businesses that are in areas that are not covered by a business association, because I think
Right. Oh,
the Old
yes.
Town Business Association, Old Tacoma Business Association and CDA are going to do a lot of their own outreach, and the other places might not have that level of outreach built in.
Exactly.
Councilmember Smith, last word. You
Uh,
got 5 minutes.
Just 4 minutes now, right?
All right.
I just want to let staff know to manage their expectations, that when they talk to business owners, a lot of times they don't know that they are paying the property taxes. So you might have to ask if you can get permission to see their end of the year payments that they have to make to the landlord, and see if it says anything about the property taxes. A lot of business owners just get an invoice from the landlord and pay it. They don't really understand what it is. Thank you.
Thanks. Awesome. All right. I think with that, I think we've given
I
some
appreciate it very
good
much.
direction.
Yes, thank you.
And we'll talk about when we're going to come back with more information on that and begin the outreach right away. So, all right. With that, we will close our meeting this evening. Reminder, we have a meeting on Monday evening with the commemoration committee, and that's it. We are adjourned.